Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at flaps and kind of understanding what they do, kind of when to use them, and kind of how to use them. So first things first, flaps are basically trailing edge devices on most aircraft. I'm not going to say all aircraft. There are actually aircraft out there that do not have flaps. They're basically going to be sitting here in the root of the wing, and they're going to be doing two basic things for us. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to be increasing the camber of the wing, which is the twist of the wing, which goes ahead and increases our lift. And it also gives you the ability to go ahead and increase the drag in order to allow us to climb down when we're approaching to a landing at a steeper angle. Now, on this particular aircraft, we're borrowing the Cessna 172 here for a kind of little example. You'll notice that we have multiple flap settings at our disposal. We basically have flaps up. Some aircraft actually what they call negative flaps. We'll take a look at that in a minute. We also have the ability to set it to 1 notch, which is going to give us 10 degrees of flaps, 2 notches, which is going to give us 20 degrees of flaps, and 3 notches, which is going to put the flaps all the way down to 30 degrees. Older versions of the Cessna 172 actually have the ability to do 40 degrees of flaps, but we can't do that because the center of gravity is so adversely affected. It basically shifts everything forward on us, making it a little bit difficult to go ahead and operate. I'll go ahead and tap my throttle. I must have touched it by my hand by accident. So let's go ahead and take a look at the flaps from the side now. Now, let me go spin around this way. Unfortunately, our weather today is a little nasty, so I'm actually going to go edit that real quick. Let's go put this to clear skies. Much better. Now you're going to have a much easier time going ahead and identifying. Actually, you know what? Let's mess with this a little bit more, too. Let's go ahead and tweak our center light here so it makes it a little bit easier to see what's going on. I think that works out. That's nice. I like that. Good. So basically, the flaps, as you can see coming from the side, this is basically called what they call a plane flap. We'll look at the rest of the flaps, is causing the airflow in the wing to now deflect downward, increasing the arc here, which is going to increase our lift. But if I stick my head from the front of the aircraft, you'll notice now that those flaps are also creating a significant amount of parasitic drag because they're getting in the way of the airflow. Now, if I go ahead and slap the flaps to the up position, you'll notice that the flaps themselves are no longer curving the wing, but at the same time they're no longer blocking the airflow. So they're going to give us both options here. So when do we use what flap? Well, that's an interesting question. Basically, your first notch of flap, your first third travel, is going to give you maximum lift for minimum effect of drag. Now, this is a very popular takeoff position because your drag is not going to be that strong, and you're going to get a pretty nice bonus to your actual lift here. Now, some aircraft you can actually cruise with one, or these would be your equivalent of combat flaps because they would just have that single notch deployed. The next notch of flaps, you're basically going to have an equal parts of both lift as well as drag. Now, this tends to be the point where your aircraft is going to produce the maximum amount of lift, and it's also going to have about an equal part increase in drag. Now, the great thing about this particular flaps position, let me zoom in a little bit so you can see a little bit better here, is you'll notice if I dip the aileron of the wing down, that the flaps and the aileron actually match each other in angle. This tells you that this particular position is going to be the spot where you're going to be getting the maximum amount of lift benefit because the ailerons were engineered to the exact same angle that the flap is now dipped down to. This particular setting is sometimes used for very short takeoff purposes, but it's also typically used in windy conditions for a landing because it does have, as you can see from the front here, a significant drag penalty. So now when you put the flaps all the way down, now what you're saying is I'm not really going to get much of a lift increase. Again, take a look at the difference in angle between my aileron and my flap now. However, you're going to be getting a maximum drag increase, which is going to allow you to slow the plane down and actually come in at a greater pitch. So to get you a better idea of what this looks like, I'm going to go ahead and pop us up in the air real quick and show you what it looks like from a visual perspective, the difference between the two flaps modes. All right, so in our first scenario here, we have no flaps. So I'm just going to give myself just the right amount of power to get us coming in right at 60 knots, which is a little bit slow for this aircraft, but it'll be fine. So right now, because none of my flaps are deployed, I'm noticing that my nose of my aircraft is significantly upwards because I need to produce more lift by increasing the angle of attack. I'm actually noticing as I'm coming in here, even though I'm doing 64, 65 knots, that it's actually very difficult to see the end of the runway on account of the fact that I'm getting all my extra lift here by pulling the nose backwards. As you can see, this is causing a bit of a problem here because it makes it tremendously difficult to safely see the runway. Now that I pitch the nose over to go ahead and get myself into my final approach here, you'll notice that my speed of the aircraft goes up significantly when I start working my way downhill here. The reason of that is, of course, now I'm not having the benefit that we would normally get from all that extra drag that those flaps would be creating. I'm going to go ahead and give myself a little bit of trim here. I'll hold it right at about 65 knots or so. Swing this way. You can see how easily this aircraft accelerates on account of the fact that there is nothing slowing us down other than, the natural drag of the airplane itself. So coming in for my landing, again, my throttle's all the way back at 0 right now. Go ahead and line ourselves up the big old number 21 there. Apparently somebody flattened all the buildings on that side of the runway. Notice the aircraft is not slowing down even though I've got my throttle back. Come over the end of the runway here. I'm going to go ahead and hold the nose up. And notice we're stuck in ground effect, and it's actually making it very difficult to get this plane down into the ground. There we go. I was wondering when this thing was going to come down. Notice there was barely any flare there as well. So that's what's going to happen when we use a no-flap approach. Notice our airspeeds were very high. There was very reduced drag, and if I got too slow, notice that the nose of the plane got up higher because I needed to create extra angle of attack to go ahead and land the plane. Now let's do the same approach, but this time we'll try it with using full flaps and see if you can notice a difference. All right, we are now all established on our final approach heading. Now my flaps have been deployed all the way down at this particular point, so I've got them all the way tipped down. Now I'm noticing that I can see the end of the runway very clearly now. The plane is actually tipped slightly downwards. I'm doing 61 knots, and I'm not having to do any of this business like we did when we had to do our original approach. The other thing I'm noticing is my RPM is significantly higher. If you look over there on the right, I'm at 1800 right now. When I was doing my original approach, I was way down here on the throttle because that extra drag wasn't being created. So my lift now is meaning I can tilt the plane down more, and that extra drag is now basically setting up so that it's much easier to go ahead and approach at a speed that I want to control. The other nice bit with this extra drag, of course, is when I do go to flare, you can see I'm actually getting a little high now. I'm actually going to drop the throttle and let the nose come down. And now notice I'm barely picking up any speed now because of all that extra drag. Again, these are not speed brakes by any means, but they do a pretty good job. There we go. It's much better. I bring the throttle in a little tiny bit here. I'm going to keep it right around 63, 64 is good. Come across the street. Fortunately, nobody's watching us land today. There's the graveyard. All airports have graveyards next to them. And I come in from my landing right here. Go ahead and pull the throttle back. Come down. Now notice when I go to flare this time, I have to actually lift the nose up in order to get this thing down, because now the flaps are going to be interacting directly with what's going on to the ground. We approached that just a little quick as well. I should have done a little heavier. Notice my braking distance is also slightly reduced. Now, if I wanted super duper short braking distance, I could actually slap the flaps up. Now, you're probably sitting here going, okay, so the idea here is if you use the flaps, it allows you to come in at a steeper angle, and it also gives you a little bit more control. Yeah, absolutely. But what about negative flaps? Now, when you switch over to other types of aircraft, especially LSAs, you'll probably notice that the whole back end of the aircraft, which is our ailerons, are also our flaps. And you'll also notice that if I actually look at the side of this aircraft very carefully, that the wing has a weird little kind of twist to it that you can see very clearly here as we're kind of sitting here idling. This is the Virus, by the way. So jumping inside, if I come down to my little flaps lever, you're going to notice that I have my notches of flaps just like we did before. We have our flaps 1, which is going to be basically, like I said, this is going to be optimized for lift. Then, of course, we have our flaps 2, which is going to give us the most amount of lift and the most amount of drag. But the other thing you're going to notice about this aircraft is there is a flaps -5, which is basically a flaps -1. Now, you're sitting there going, why on earth would you do that? Well, let me go ahead and stick my head on here. I really wish I could take this little piece of metal out of the way. So let me go ahead and put the flaps to 0. Go ahead and take a look at the structure of the wing for a second here. We have it relatively flat, and it's curved up just a teeny tiny bit. If you look on the underside, you can see it's got a distinctive kind of arc to it as well. Let me slap the flaps to the up position. Do you see what we just did to the wing? We just made the wing straighter. Now you're sitting there going, oh, so if you make the wing straighter, you reduce your induced drag from basically any sort of lift. The answer is yes, that's exactly what you do. You also notice if I dip the flaps all the way down, that you have to actually mechanically combine my aileron motion with my flap motion. You can see that's very distinctive what that looks like here. But now, of course, we don't know exactly how far we need to dip this thing in order to safely. But you can see, look what I do with my aileron. It's basically vertical there when I go ahead and crank on it. So for this particular aircraft, I'm going to go ahead and set the flaps all the way to the 0 position. And now we're just going to effect a regular takeoff here. I'm going to go ahead and give this thing full throttle, get ourselves a little bit of speed. Again, there's no wind or anything like that today, so you don't have to worry about any of those aspects of it. Get up to a rotate speed. Again, this is a Virus. It gets going pretty quick. Give that thing a nice gentle tug, about 55, 56 knots. We are nice and airborne using our no flap settings. Now you're sitting there going, okay, so far so good, so far so good. What happens if we use the negative flaps? Well, when we switch to the negative flaps, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be exchanging a little bit of lift for a reduction in drag. So let's go ahead and give this thing full throttle again. Go ahead and release. Now what we've done is we've taken that wing, we've actually made it flatter. So what's going to happen is we're going to suffer a little bit as far as lift, but that also means we're going to reduce our drag, which is going to improve our cruise speed. So I'm going to go ahead and give this thing a tug, and you'll notice that it was a little bit different. It didn't quite hesitate or anything like that, but you're also noticing as I'm climbing here is that I'm actually picking up a little bit of speed. Now in the POH for this aircraft, you're not supposed to be doing a negative flaps takeoff. Now if you want to see something really interesting here, I can actually shut off the flaps. I'm going to go ahead and bop that button. Watch, the whole aircraft does barely anything at all, which I think is very, very interesting. Now, what we'll do now is we'll go back and take off again, but this time we'll try with 20 degrees to show you the difference. All right, now watch this. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to put the flaps all the way down. So again, it just feels weird that flaps up and flaps down. So now what we're doing is we're increasing the curvature of the wing substantially here. Now, our original takeoff, again, was with no flaps, and you already had that curvature. We tried it with a negative. So let's go ahead and see what happens this time. I'm going to go ahead and give it a little teeny tiny nub. Again, remember, we're at maximum lift for maximum drag right now. So it's taken us a little bit while to get going. But the interesting thing is I can lift the nose up and get airborne at 45 knots, which is a really, really big difference because I've got so much more lift. But notice, I'm going to go ahead and let the nose come down a little bit here. This plane does not want to accelerate right now because of all that drag. Let's go ahead and cancel out those 2 notches of flaps and watch what happens with the aircraft speed. See how it starts to accelerate as that extra drag goes away, but notice the plane wanted to sink a little bit as we started generating an enormous amount of extra lift as well. So again, that's kind of the basics to what we're going to see with those flaps. Now you're probably saying, okay, so that's pretty useful. So basically what you're telling me is if you want to take off in a shortest distance, you've got to use flaps that match the ailerons. That's correct. If you want to approach safely, you want to use as much flaps as you can. Also correct. What about if you're in an airliner? Yeah, I had to go with world travel. I'm sorry. I couldn't find my Delta livery quick enough here, so I kind of stuck with the old school here. So in airliners, it's actually the same exact concept as it is with our little general aviation plane. You'll notice that I have this massive, 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 massive collection of flaps. Remember, this thing is tremendously heavy. You know, this is hundreds of thousands of pounds right now. So you'll notice that our flaps are actually specialized flaps. These are called Fowler flaps, or actually split Fowler flaps. And you'll also notice that the front of the aircraft wing has something special called slats. Basically, what the flaps on an airliner does is the exact same thing as it does on our little general aviation plane. The slats will pop out to basically increase the size of the wing and supercharge the air coming over it. And then the flaps will actually go ahead and deploy themselves so that they can not only come down to increase the curvature of the wing, but they'll also actually come out and have little tiny gaps in them to force air over the top of the flap, basically making a miniature wing here, in addition to increasing the curvature of the big wing. So you can see here that my little slats have popped out of the front, which basically are going to do 2 things. It's going to let air go over the top and air go through, so you supercharge this air, and you notice that my flaps themselves, look at how far they can dip down, as well as let air through them over the top, in vastly, 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 vastly improving the actual lift of the actual wing. And naturally, of course, if I look at it from the front, if you're going to be cranking those flaps all the way down, you're also going to get a significant amount of both parasitic as well as induced drag. Now, you're probably saying, well, just what is the impact on an airliner like this? You know, what air flap settings should I be using for everything? If I actually take my head and kind of look down here, if you first start up this aircraft, you're probably on a position page that looks a little bit like this. Believe it or not, you can actually dial in the performance of flaps at any time. So if I actually go to root prefer, takeoff page, there we go. You can also, of course, go to the index and go down to the takeoff page. You'll notice I have 3 V speeds listed. This is going to be the speed I lift the nose. This is going to be the speed that the aircraft should start climbing up. This will be my rotate speed here. I'm sorry, decision, rotate, climb. So what you'll notice now is if I left click on each one of these, they stay at 170 knots for the first one. This would be my speed that I would need to lift up the nose on. Now keep in mind, this speed is completely dependent on whatever flap setting I dial over here. So right now my flaps are at 0. I'm actually going to float over to the other seat here. It's going to be a little bit easier to say. Here we go. Okay, now that I'm in this seat, it's going to be much more clear. So now watch this. I'm going to set my flaps down a single notch, which is just going to pop my slats out. So I'm going to take my mouse, click here, and you're going to see that just popping those slats out has reduced my rotation speed significantly because I've created a more wing area as well as supercharged that air. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and pop my flaps down to 15 degrees, which is the typical suggested takeoff setting for this particular aircraft. I'll go ahead and give it a moment to actually descend there. Now this should be in the right position. Let me go ahead and take a look. Yep, looks good. So now watch what happens when I click. My new rotate speed is down almost 20 knots because of the enhanced amount of lift I'm going. Now, some of you are saying, can you keep going? Well, sure. Let's go all the way down to 20, which was basically our maximum takeoff on a little Cessna here. Let's give it a few moments to get into position. So 162, let's see what it drops down to. 147. That's another 13-knot reduction. So we're down 40 knots because of the insane amount of lift that those flaps create. And, of course, we're going to go all the way. We'll pop that all the way down to 30 for a second there. I know of no technique where you'd ever need to use 30 degrees of flaps for a takeoff. That's not to say you can't, it just means typically it doesn't exist. So let's see what that does for us here. 137 knots. So again, we're starting to lose some quality here. Yes, it means that we're able to rotate at a significantly reduced speed. However, this is also going to be a lot of drag, which is going to give us a long time to get up to that speed. Granted, this is a Boeing 787, so this thing can certainly move. So now if I take a peek out the back, you can see those flaps are all the way down. They're giving us a tremendous, tremendous amount of lift. So what settings should you use? You should use the use that depends on the condition that you're working on. Each one of these aircraft have pretty nasty books that basically explain when to use what particular setting, but in general, 15 degrees for airliners is pretty typical. When you're coming in for a landing, you want to get this number as low as possible, so you want to go ahead and make sure you use all the rest. So to kind of leave us all today, I'm going to go ahead and get ourselves a nice little takeoff here. Go ahead and pop off the parking brake. It looks pretty good here. I'm going to smoothly push the throttle all the way forward. I'm going to demonstrate just how short of a takeoff that you can actually get with a 787. Now, some people are probably sitting there going, well, is it possible to put the flaps down as you accelerate so you can get a bit of speed as well as reduce your drag there? The answer is yes, but that is not considered an improved technique. I've never met an airline pilot who actually says that that's something you can validly do. Notice, by the way, that we're struggling a little bit to kind of get going. I'm also at full weight, so that probably explains a lot of it. But if my flaps were still up or I used a lesser flaps, I'd be able to accelerate quickly. So you get that kind of a diminishing return that you kind of got to watch out for there. There's my V1. That's my decision speed. Notice how much runway I've consumed here. That's my VR. That's my rotate speed. I'm going to go ahead and give the controls a little nudge. I got to load the fly-by-wire here. And we're struggling to get airborne because we have so much extra drag here. All right, pop it up to about 10 degrees. Looks pretty good. And I'm going to go slowly start milking those flaps upwards because right now we have so much drag on this airplane. This thing just does not want to climb. Oh, okay. So let's try this takeoff again, but this time let's try it with the correct amount of flaps. All right, now you're going to see why it's important to select it. So I'm going to go back over to our little position here. I'm going to go pop my flaps all the way up. 1, 2, 3, 4. That should give us 15 degrees of flaps. Yep, you can see 15 degrees is selected. Let's go ahead and head over to my position. We'll go performance, thrust limitation. There we go. We'll go ahead and update our information. So 162. So you're going to see sitting there going, well, wait a minute. Your rotate speed is now higher than it was a minute ago. Therefore, you're going to take up more runway. Well, let's find out, shall we? Go ahead and give it full throttle just like I did the last time. Go ahead and release the parking brake, and off we go. So now we're going to be getting a little bit more lift, but we're going to have a lot less drag. So let's see what kind of the impact of those two factors together, and you'll kind of see why. Now remember in the previous one, even though we're already accelerating a little bit quicker here, even though we were able to get airborne in a relatively low speed, we really struggled to get any altitude because we had so much drag still. So let's see how that is different when you do it like this. Notice though, my rotate speed's a lot higher than it was a moment ago. And pretty good exercise with your feet with this aircraft, not gonna lie. Remember, we are still at maximum takeoff weight here. So there's my V1. Notice I'm using about the same amount of runway here. There's my rotate. I'm gonna go ahead and gently flick back on the nose. And we are airborne, but notice our airspeed is 180 knots already. So now I'm going to go ahead and lift the nose up just a little bit more, and we are cruising. So we ended up using about the same amount of runway, but the difference now is I'm not basically standing on my tail in a high drag situation. I'm able to smoothly transition right to climbing fleet, as well as bring up the rest of my notches of flaps. So now you can kind of see the two directly next to each other. Go ahead and push the nose down just a little tiny bit here. And we are on our way. All right, hopefully that helps as far as having a good understanding of flaps. At the end of the day, when you're landing, you should always be using full flaps unless it's too windy to use full flaps. When you're taking off, you generally don't want to use more than the 2/3 point on your flaps or half flaps. Certain aircraft are different. If you have an aircraft with split flaps, such as a DC-3, you're not really ever going to be able to use flaps during takeoff that often as it is, because the split flaps create a tremendous amount of extra drag. And if you're an airliner, even though you can use significant amounts of flaps to help you go ahead and get you a lower speed takeoff, all that extra drag is going to drastically impact your ability to climb out from the airport from which you came. Enjoy.